Welcome to the Radically Genuine Podcast. I am Dr. Roger McFillin. All truth passes through three stages. First, it's ridiculed. Second, it's violently opposed. Third, it is accepted as being self-evident. That is a quote by Arthur Schopenhauer. In an age of unprecedented technological advancement and scientific discovery, we face a paradox that few dare to confront. Why is our understanding of the human mind, arguably our most vital frontier, seemingly moving backwards? Despite billions invested in neuroscience research and an explosion of brain image technology, rates of mental illness continue to soar. Autism has increased at least 200-fold since the 1980s. Depression and anxiety are reaching epidemic proportions. And what is promoted as medicine provides only marginal relief or benefit, if that. Could our entire framework for understanding consciousness and the brain be fundamentally flawed? We've built our modern understanding of psychiatry and neuroscience on the assumption that consciousness emerges from brain activity, that our thoughts, feelings, and awareness are merely byproducts of neurons firing. Yet this model fails to explain a growing body of anomalous data, from the placebo effect to documented cases of expanded consciousness and near-death experiences. Most provocatively, it cannot account for the extraordinary abilities of autistic savants who can perform complex mathematical calculations instantly, create precise artistic masterpieces without training, or access information in ways that defy our understanding of perception and memory. What if consciousness isn't generated by the brain at all, but rather channeled through it, like a radio receives signals? How do we explain savants who can multiply 9-digit numbers in their head instantly, but can't perform basic addition? Or those who can recreate entire cityscapes in perfect detail after a single glance? What if some conditions we label as disorders are actually reflecting expanded rather than impaired states of consciousness? And what if our rigid adherence to materialist models of mind have led us to systematically dismiss and pathologize human capabilities that lie beyond our current scientific framework? These aren't just philosophical musings, they're questions with profound implications for how we understand human potential and even treat mental health conditions. If our fundamental assumptions about consciousness are wrong, it would explain why we're losing ground in the battle against mental illness despite our advancing technology. It would suggest why some of our most powerful psychiatric medications often work no better than placebos and have problematic long-term consequences. And it might reveal why certain individuals, particularly those whose minds operate differently from the norm, sometimes demonstrate abilities that our current scientific paradigm fails to understand, from seemingly telepathic connections to superhuman feats of calculation and memory. The guardians of mainstream science have a long history of dismissing evidence that challenges their fundamental beliefs. But what happens when the evidence presents itself to someone trained at the pinnacles of medical research? When a Johns Hopkins trained neuroscientist and psychiatrist encounters phenomena that shake the very foundations of brain science, does she ignore what she's seen or risk her professional reputation to investigate? Our guest chose the latter path, applying rigorous scientific methodology to explore abilities that her colleagues often misunderstand or even dismiss, a decision that would not only threaten her medical license, but transform our understanding of human consciousness. Dr. Diane Hennacy Powell is a pioneering neuroscientist and psychiatrist whose research challenges conventional understandings of consciousness and human potential. After training at Johns Hopkins and serving on Harvard Medical School's faculty, she's investigated extraordinary phenomena through a rigorous scientific lens. Her groundbreaking work focuses on autistic savants and non-speaking autistic individuals with remarkable abilities, including telepathic capabilities. This research is featured in her acclaimed book, The ESP Enigma, The Scientific Case for Psychic Phenomena, and forms the centerpiece of the documentary series, The Telepathy Tapes, where she conducts rigorous testing of these extraordinary abilities alongside host Kai Dickens. The series explores how these silent communicators possess gifts that defy conventional understanding, from telepathy to otherworldly perceptions. Beyond exploring consciousness, Dr. Powell has made significant contributions to trauma treatment, establishing the psychiatry program for survivors of torture, international in San Diego. As a former researcher for the Salk Institute's think tank on human consciousness and the director of research for Johnny Mack Institute, Dr. Powell brings a multidisciplinary approach to understanding psychological anomalies. I can't wait to pick her brain today. Dr. Powell, welcome to the Radically Genuine podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
So you began your career at what we would consider the pinnacles of conventional medicine, Johns Hopkins, Harvard Medical School, where the materialist view of consciousness does reign supreme. Yet today you're documenting phenomena that your former colleagues would often dismiss, even facing the suspension of your medical license for daring to investigate them. So I guess the best way to introduce you to my audience is, what were some of these watershed moments that forced you to question everything that you've been taught about the human mind?
I would say the major one was when I was on faculty at Harvard and I was asked to consult on a patient who was on a medical floor and wanted to leave against medical advice. And you're not allowed to sign out against medical advice if they think that you're incompetent. And she was telling the staff she saw ghosts and that she was psychic. And so everybody assumed that she had a mental illness, and they called me in to see her. And within 5-10 minutes of meeting her, she started to tell me things that there was just no way that she could know. She told me my husband's profession and that he was applying for a job in 2 different cities, which was happening that very week. She told me where we would end up, which we did. We ended up in San Diego. And it was just one of those things where it was so profound and it was so contradictory to what I had been trained that I felt that I had a duty to really investigate it as a phenomenon.
Yeah, curious to know, in that moment, how did you think about it, given what your previous training had been?
Well, it's interesting, and I talk about this in my book. How I thought about it was, first of all, although we were told that these things were evidence of mental illness, these are things that have been reported by people across time, across cultures. And I knew that our model for understanding the brain and consciousness was seriously incomplete. That we really, that it's just a large assumption on the part of neuroscience that the brain's what creates consciousness. And I also was aware of theoretical physics because I took a fair amount of physics as an undergraduate. I found it interesting, and I have a brother who's a theoretical physicist, and we'd have conversations about consciousness and about, so for example, some of the conversations between Carl Jung and Wolfgang Pauli about synchronicities and how that there's really this world that quantum physicists and various mystics from the East would discuss, and it really implied that some of these phenomena actually were not only possible but maybe even likely to occur, at least occasionally.
Yeah, in many indigenous cultures, they value voices, visions, expanded perceptual states that Western medicine labels as psychosis, with the assumption that there's a underlying kind of brain dysfunction that would be, influencing that experience. Do you believe our current model of mental illness, from that perspective, is doing more harm than good?
I do believe it's doing a lot of harm. I think that what's happened is you have a lot of people who are afraid to talk with their clinicians about what it is they experience because they know there will be a judgment. Others that say what they're experiencing are automatically put on medications without any sort of attempt to see, well, is it possible that what they're telling me is actually true? And so that's really, really harmful.
I'm curious to know about your thinking about, what happens when we do choose to prescribe medications, antipsychotic drugs, for example, when somebody might be experiencing this altered state. Um, if we can take a step back and assume that there is potential value to experiencing what we label as psychosis, uh, it could be something where there is a connection to a greater sense of consciousness or greater awareness. It could be possible. Uh, it could be helping create meaning in a term of distress. Do you think the idea of labeling it as a disorder and then prescribing that drug, do you think that may interfere with some natural processes that people experience or go through?
Oh, I think absolutely it could interfere with those processes. And it also can, like, for example, antipsychotics can really dull people. So there's just a whole host of side effects from it. And yet at the same time, some people who have these experiences are extremely dysregulated. So there's a difference between people who just kind of casually say to someone, well, I had this experience where, my boyfriend and I were able to, um, pass this information back and forth, and I don't know how it happened. Versus someone who comes in and says, I'm really disturbed by the constant voices that I hear. And, my thoughts are, people are reading my thoughts and I can't go out in public because I'm so paranoid. That's somebody who needs help. And so it's not that there isn't a place for helping these individuals. It's that just because people say they have certain experiences, we shouldn't automatically think that they're mentally ill.
Yeah, I guess it certainly depends on the nature of its impairment. And I think when it's spoken in terms of like emergency medicine, for example, and these drugs can be used to help somebody who is really dysregulated or potentially dangerous to themselves or others, is one thing. But how mainstream psychiatry kind of talks about it as needing to be on that drug for life, or that the drug itself can correct an underlying brain dysfunction instead of it's perturbing natural processes, is where we start to cross the line of safe and evidence-based medicine into something that really is more fabricated or created to fit a narrative than anything that's really sound science.
Right. I mean, one of the extremes of this is I had a patient who was an equestrian, and she had told me about how she has this ability to understand what the horse needed, what the horse was feeling. I mean, and anybody who's been somebody who spends a lot of time around horses, they oftentimes report that they develop this relationship with the horse where they're kind of like one unit. After you've worked with them, the same horse over and over again. And so she mentioned this to her general practitioner, that she had this ability, and her general practitioner sent me a letter saying that he thought she should go on an antipsychotic because of it.
Yeah, that's sad. And I know that you've had quite a history of working with trauma survivors, and I think that I've heard you on another podcast describing some of those formative experiences for you, and I think you've experienced things that I've experienced as a clinician working with trauma survivors. Cross culturally, that's probably shifted your perspective on Western ideas of mental illness and recovery. What is some of your experience in working with trauma survivors that helped kind of shape your direction of your career?
Wow. Well, one of the things I would say is that I became an expert on people who experience severe trauma in early childhood. And if you know much about child development, you know that children can disassociate more easily than adults. In other words, they can have this experience that we would call an out of body experience, where they just literally, their seat of consciousness seems to be outside of their body and just kind of looking at events as they occur around them. And it's something that occurs in a majorly stressful situation, whether somebody's in severe pain or, extreme of this is like near death experiences where people actually die and then are brought back to life, and there's usually an out of body experience that's a part of that. And so, in working with these people who'd been extremely traumatized very early on, what I discovered is, first of all, that they could disassociate very easily, which, I mean, the literature supports that. But then I also realized that they oftentimes had more intuition than, what they had, like a radar for picking up things. And one could say, well, on a survival, if you think about survival of the fittest and whatnot, there'd be a survival value to, if you've been traumatized early on, to have a better radar at sort of reading somebody else's intentions. I mean, maybe you make that, a high priority of yours. But what I found was that oftentimes the people who had that severe trauma also seem to know things that they shouldn't know, just like the patient at Harvard. So besides the autistic savants, I find that people with early trauma oftentimes have a highly developed intuition. Um, that's one thing I would say. And then I'd also say that there's a with trauma, it's very dysregulating to this whole balance between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic system. And so you have a need for people who've been traumatized to really learn to reset that balance.